All right. Well, did you watch the big debate the other night? Thursday night was the main event. Yours truly, Matthew Everhard, taking on Keith Foskey, my friend, on the mode of baptism. We did a great debate, over 2 hours and 15 minutes on the Real Dead Man Walking podcast channel with our host, Greg, who did a great job moderating the debate. You know, as I think about the debate afterwards, and there were several different little polls online in different places on the Reformed Pub and on Twitter about who won the debate or what side a person takes on the debate. One of the things that it kind of strikes me is that this is a bit of a Rorschach test in which you see what you want to see in the information. You know those Rorschach tests where they show an ink blot and somebody's supposed to see what kind of, picture they think they see in this. I do think that this is one of these kinds of topics where people look at the data, the various strands of data, and they interpret it from two different lenses, two different grids. And it seems to be the case that Baptists, no matter what arguments you present, always end up seeing immersion as the only form of baptism that the New Testament really suggests. Whereas we who are Presbyterians, we tend to see this as a great depiction of God's pouring out his grace and mercies, and so therefore we prefer pouring or sprinkling as a mode of baptism. And we're looking at the same text, we're looking at some of the same information, we are assessing it from our various perspectives. And I don't think very often people are completely convinced by the other person's position. In fact, in those polls, usually what you end up polling on, the Facebook or Twitter or whatever is what did you believe at the beginning of the debate, because that's probably what you believe at the end of the debate. Very few people, I think, are actually pulled away from their moorings of one position towards the other position. But I do like the debate format, and I do think it's an excellent way to exchange information, because so many times these debates online, especially on Twitter or Facebook, they end up turning into these ridiculous posting sessions in which people are not making really coherent, rational arguments, and they're basically just defending their previous conceptions. But the debate format allows both sides to fully articulate their view, with some time constraints, of course, and then to do what is very rarely done, which is to cross-examine the other position and ask hard questions of that particular position. Now, as it relates to Keith and I's debate, I thought there were a few very interesting moments that came up during my cross-examination of Keith. And so for me, again, Rorschach test, right? I thought this was a pretty strong series of moments on my part in which I was able to get Keith to admit a few things that sometimes people on the other side don't want to admit. So what we're going to do in this video is we're just going to reduce the 2 hour and 15-minute video to just that portion where I cross-examine Keith. And of course, you are welcome to draw your own conclusions from this portion of the debate. I thought it was very helpful. I'm sure Keith thought his cross-examination of me was very helpful as well. But that notwithstanding, let's go ahead and have a look at this portion of the debate in its entirety. 10 minutes or so of my cross-examination of Keith.
Matthew, for both of your rebuttal statements, that was awesome. We're going to move into the cross-examination period. Before we do, I just want to remind people, I have been putting it on the screen. We do have questions coming in after we do the cross-examination portion. Both Matthew and Keith will be taking questions, and I have about 5 or 6 good ones that I picked out so far, but continue to keep posting those. I will save those in the file, and then we will get to those after this. So during the cross-examination period, Matthew, you will be starting. You will have 10 minutes to ask Keith any questions you want. Keith, you can respond to those questions, but we do ask that you do not ask questions back. You will have time to do that in your 10-minute period. So, Matthew, your time starts now.
Okay. Well, Keith, thanks again for that. I thought that was really excellent. And I continue to be impressed with your scholarship and your gentlemanly deportment for sure. And I do want to say that no matter what else happens, brother, I do love you in the Lord. And I've been praying for you all day today. And in fact, I've even prayed this prayer that if I'm wrong in this, then let Keith win the debate, because I definitely want the truth of Christ to be known. And you've certainly evidenced that gentlemanly spirit as we've gone forth through this. So I just want to let you know that I'm not trying to trick you in any of these questions. There's no gotcha moments or anything like that coming, so you can relax as far as that goes. And honestly, you've been so gracious in your opinions. Some of the questions that I was going to try to ask you are they're moot points now because of the answers that you've given, especially with relation to mutually opening the Lord's table and such. I wasn't sure what you would say about that, but let me throw out a first question for you here. So here's a reductio ad absurdum question, reducing the question to the level of the absurd. Suppose you're baptizing somebody and you're going to use one of those trough things that you mentioned before, the ancient practice of the animal trough for baptisms. And you're baptizing somebody and let's say they don't fit. I've actually seen this before. Let's say they don't go down. Let's say their knees are sticking out or their hair doesn't go in, or, their arms are hanging out. Does that count? Is that an immersion?
Yeah, this is actually, and I don't want to waste time, but I do want to tell a very quick funny story if I might. There's a video of me doing a baptism online where we were at the beach and we had only walked out to knee deep water, and I didn't realize that the young man wasn't going to become fully immersed. So you see me baptize him twice, not because I was trying to go for a triple immersion as the Eastern Orthodox do, but because I didn't see him go under the water completely. And I did want to do that. I do think the goal is complete immersion, but I don't think that it's invalidated if a toe is sticking out or something like that. I would certainly say that the goal is full immersion and the picture of going down and coming back up is there. But I think a knee deep water, if a person laid flat on and their toe was sticking up, I don't think that would invalidate it in any way.
So you'd try again, though. It sounds like you're saying that
I
if
said
you
I
tried and
I tried it again only because when I went to do it, he didn't go hardly down at all. It was
okay.
just such a ordinarily I would want the person to go all the way under the water. Yes.
Yeah.
And so yes.
Did you say the words, I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit twice, once more, just to get that second attempt, that second go at it?
No, I didn't. I don't think, because he was only part way up when I went back down.
Okay.
So again, you can go watch the video. It's on my channel. But I took him down but he didn't go under the water. I brought him up and then went again. So I didn't repeat the words.
Now, you mentioned the baptism of Christ a couple of times and as something of a model for what Christian baptism should look like. So here's my question for you. Do you think that was a Christian baptism? Was that a Trinitarian baptism that Jesus experienced there? Or was this the baptism of John?
No, I thought I said this in my opening, so if I wasn't clear, forgive me. But I did say that there is a distinction to be made between John's baptism and Christian baptism, and I recognize that. But I do believe that the disciples of Jesus, who were the ones who carried out the baptism of Jesus afterward, would have followed the same pattern. I don't see any reason for a discontinuity of pattern. And you, being a Presbyterian, love continuity a lot. I know you do. It's a big part of your theology. So I don't think there would be a discontinuity except in the words used. I don't think John baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, but I do believe the followers of Jesus did after Jesus commanded them to in Matthew 28.
What do you make of the Hebrews 9:10 diaphoros baptismois passage that I referenced? Do you grant that the various baptisms described in Hebrews 9 are references to Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus as I described them, or what else do you make of that text?
I don't have any problem with that. And again, as I said in my opening, I don't have any issue with the fact that baptizo can have a wide semantic range and that it can reference washing. I do think, though, that to say washing is not immersion, I think is a little bit of a, it's kind of like saying, well, it might not be immersion because you mentioned Mark's gospel where it says they baptize couches, and certainly it's hard to get a couch all the way under the water. I do think the sense of washing with water is the idea there. And in that sense, the washing, of course, references that same context and type of use of baptizo. I think that's possible. So I don't have a problem with that as a referent there.
I mentioned Luke 11:37-38 in, I think it was my rebuttal section, where the Pharisee is surprised that he's astonished. It says that Jesus does not baptize before meals. How do you take that? Do you take that as immersion, or do you take that as a ceremonial hand washing, probably performed by pouring there?
Well, I would say it's a ceremonial hand washing. I think that what's being referenced to not baptizing is not baptizing his hands, would have been putting them under the water. Now, whether or not it's in a pool of water or the water being poured on, it's still going underneath. Going under the water is a whether it's being poured on or immersed in that sense, it's his hands, not his whole body.
But you rule out the obvious interpretation. What I would say was an obviously faulty interpretation that he's referring to Jesus being fully immersed every time he eats a meal, right?
No, yeah. No. I would not say that baptizo there means that he's to be immersed before every meal. Absolutely. Yeah.
Nobody would rightly hold that position, I wouldn't think, right?
There may be some who take a very hard line on baptizo always meaning immersion. I think you made a good point, and again, I don't want to take your time away, but you said it doesn't have to be immersed. It means dip. You talked about the birds, dipping
Mm-hmm.
in the blood, and it can't be fully submersed, but it's still the idea of going into something rather than something poured on it. Again, baptizo being we're going into rather than sprinkling or pouring, which is passive, it's happening to us rather than us going into. So I think that's a consideration there.
What do you make of the New Testament author's use of the Septuagint? Do you grant that when the apostles are writing, they're often using the Septuagint, almost
Mhm.
always, in fact?
Yeah, I don't have any issue with that at all.
Okay. So in passages like those that I adduced with Jonathan's staff being dipped into the honey or Nebuchadnezzar's body being baptizoed in the dew of the morning, you would interpret those to something besides an immersion and a reemergence, correct?
Yeah, but I'm glad you asked this question because I wanted to mention this. And again, I promise to everyone I'm not becoming Eastern Orthodox, but I did spend a little time in preparation listening to some Eastern Orthodox arguments because I wanted to know why they have continued to immerse for as long as they have. And one of the points that was made by one of the priests I listened to was that even in pouring, the water should encompass the whole body, right? Like that's his view of even in exception cases like the Didache. So when we talk about the dew that was on um Nebuchadnezzar, I don't think it was just dew on his head. I think his whole body was wet, not in like in a pool, but I think he was completely wet from the dew of the morning. So I think there's a sense in which immersion and being completely wet, because I think the two can be synonymous in one sense of you can be completely wet without having to be put under the water, if that makes sense.
You mentioned that Romans 6 describes baptism as baptism into the death of Christ.
Mhm.
Are you aware of any common practice in which people were buried at sea in the ancient Near East, buried in the water?
I do not know, so I can't speak one way or the other to that.
Have you ever heard of anything like that?
No, I know it's done in our military, such as in the Navy, they'll bury men at sea, but I've never studied the history of that, so I can't speak to it.
Okay, so you think it's unlikely that the element there being described as a burial at sea or a burial into the, let's say, either the Jordan River or the Mediterranean Sea, you think that's very unlikely, right?
1 minute left, Matthew.
Yeah, but I would say that's almost saying that the picture has to be so connected to a reality that it can't have any connection. So you have to so because they didn't bury at sea, that means going under the water can't be a picture of burial and resurrection. I don't see the two of those coming being deduced
Okay.
together.
And just the last question. If a person's baptized into Christ, a la Romans chapter 6, you wouldn't suggest that they are in Christ and then out of Christ, right? That would not be correct.
Not at all. It's union in his death, burial, and resurrection. We who have died to Christ now live for him, right? That's the picture. It's the picture of his going into the tomb and coming out. We are united with him in that picture of dying and raising. We even say that when we put someone other, we say buried with him in baptism, raised to the newness of life. That's the taken directly from Romans chapter 6.
Great. Thank you. All right. Now, what did you make of that? Because I thought that that was actually a really effective cross-examination on my part. Now, again, Rorschach test, we're going to see what we want to see in these answers. Keith probably feels, and perhaps rightly so, that he did a very good job of answering these questions. But as for me, I felt like I had scored every takedown that I attempted in that period. To make a wrestling analogy, every shot I took, every time I got in on his legs, I finished the takedown and scored my 3 points. I felt like in each one of those questions that I asked, Keith answered it in the way that I was hoping that he would answer it. And I told him there were no trick questions. I was not trying to trick him into saying something that he didn't want to say. But I do think it was very powerful and effective. First, I got him to admit that if a person was not fully immersed, that he would retry that. And he gives an example of there being a video of him trying multiple times, twice, to get a person fully immersed, which seems to suggest that there's a perfectionism of practicality that Keith would hold to, in which an immersion doesn't fully count unless the person fully goes underneath the water. Secondly, he admitted quite readily that Jesus was subject to the baptism of John, that he did not think that this was a full Christian Trinitarian baptism, which of course countervails the point that Christ's baptism is something of a prescriptive model for us as believers today that we are supposed to imitate and to follow. After that, I got Keith to admit that Hebrews 9:10, diaphoros baptismois, various baptisms in the book of Hebrews, refers to sprinkling or pouring ceremonies from the Old Testament. He was not willing to try to make some sort of a contorted argument that that implies any kind of immersion found in the Old Testament. And I knew that Keith would have no other answer for that, because the text there is just so clear that these kinds of baptisms are sprinkling or pouring ceremonies from the Old Testament. In Luke 11:38, I got Keith to admit that we were not talking about an immersion of the body into water, but rather either a washing or pouring ceremony that the Pharisees would perform upon their hands before eating of the meal. So we clearly got Keith to disabuse the fallacious argument that this is some sort of a use of baptizo, which implies or demands immersion. Next, I got Keith to admit that the New Testament writers used the Septuagint and heavily depend upon it, perhaps even exclusively in their quotations and allusions from the Old Testament. Whenever the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament, they're quoting the Septuagint, and that therefore, if you're not following the logic there, the extension here is that they would use a word like baptizo in similar ways to how it is used in the Septuagint. And in my appendix video, in which I go through 20 examples of baptizo not meaning immerse, I depended upon the Septuagint there. And so what follows that is that the New Testament writers would use baptizo in similar ways to the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And then on Romans 6, I thought this was powerful too, because first I got Keith to admit that there is not an ancient practice of water or sea burial that ancient Jews or early Christians used. And so the idea that we're talking about some sort of prescription for water baptism in Romans 6 obviously does not hold. We do not bury people into water. The point is that you bury people in the earth. And so therefore there's a category error here that what's being discussed, the kind of baptism that we're talking about, is actually the doctrine of union with Christ, which Keith also admitted there in that particularly salient moment of the cross-examination. All right, well, I thought that 10 minutes went exceptionally well on my side, as, again, to make a wrestling analogy, every shot I took, I finished the takedown, and probably tech-falled him in that period. I'd love to know what you think about that cross-examination and perhaps even Keith's cross-examination of me. That's all I have for today in this particular video. Thank you for checking in. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.